I'm Nicola Tallant, and Crime World is back at Cork Opera House on March 27th, where Niall and I will be uncovering the secret world of Christy, the Dapper Don Kinahan. Join us for this live show. Tickets, corkpodcastfestival.ie. The killing of teenager Keane Mulready-Woods, whose body was dismembered and dumped as a message to rivals of gangland psycho Robbie Lawlor, was a seismic event in modern organised crime. It followed the fracturing of a major drug gang where a younger mob took on the older order for control of the drug trade in the town of Drogheda. The feud, which bubbled for months, eventually turned into all-out war, where the rule of law almost completely broke down. Killing Keane is a new 5-part subscriber-only podcast special for crimeworld.com. And today I'm talking with Emer Rabbit about the new series. Stay tuned for a free episode. You're listening to Crime World, a podcast from crimeworld.com. Right, so we have a new series up on crimeworld.com for subscribers only, but we're going to have a little bit of a chat about it, and then we're going to run some of episode 1 at the end of this podcast so people can have a little taster of it. And it's around the killing, it's called Killing Keane. It's around the killing of Keane Mulready-Woods.
Yeah.
And myself and Eamon, we have to give him the full credit on this.
Yeah.
He took the deep dive and provided me with all his research material, which we then went through. But it's a fascinating time that it happens. And we go back and look at that sort of feud that had been bubbling for a long time before it really kicked off.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of a classic one. It's often been said to me, what happened in Drogheda could happen anywhere.
Yeah.
You know, you hear about these feuds like Longford a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, there's other areas of the country where there's this sort of tit for tat, sort of arson attacks and then maybe a little bit of graffiti and stuff like that. But all of a sudden they can just blow up.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Like, and we've seen that in, obviously, like there was drug intimidation stuff going on in Offaly, and then that house attack where the poor child and his grand-aunt were killed. And then there's like a lot of violence going on in North Dublin now between two families in Ballymun. So yeah, you just, all you need is something like this to happen, and then it becomes like, it's that kind of thing, isn't it? Then the politicians get involved, and then it becomes a big deal. But there's these, like, as Eamon and yourself were saying in the podcast, like this feud in Louth had been going on for years.
And there's key characters involved in that. I suppose at the beginning you have to look at Owen Maguire and his brother Brendan on one side of it, linked with Cornelius Price, very dangerous individuals. And there's a kind of a young crew who have been working for them, who were always said to have been kind of badly bullied when they were younger by them. And set to work. There's the Boylan brothers and there's the likes of Paul Crosby, very volatile criminals. And they kind of decide they're going to go out on their own. They're sick of being told what to do. They can take on the older crew. And it gets really, really dirty. I mean, I had forgotten about that phone call that Paul Crosby put up on social media. And of course it is all run on social media. And he phones up Owen Maguire, who's been shot by Robbie Lawlor at Cement Road where he was living. And he survived the hit, but he has spent a long time in hospital and he's been left in a wheelchair. And he phones him up and starts slagging him off about nappies and that he'll come up and bring him for an L walk and all. And he's this young guy who's just so out of control. You can just see it from that phone call.
And a guy actually was surprised at his age. He was only 24 when Keane Mulready-Woods was killed. Like, that's just, but he was seen as a really serious criminal and he was really heavily involved in the feuding. And I think he had been sort of like groomed into all that and treated really badly when he was a youngster. But he was only 24 and he was like carrying out all this kind of thing. And it was just this reckless sort of like volatile. I think that's the word you used for that gang, for that feud, don't you? It was just, there were so many volatile characters there.
So many. And of course then there was a series of things that happened that you know, Cornelius Price was in prison. Robbie Lawlor was in prison. Robbie Lawlor's facing this charge relating to, he shows up at a house of a woman whose son is dating his ex-partner. And he's accused of coming to the back door and shooting through the door. There's a trial, but because this is, you know, you can't imagine Robbie Lawlor being anywhere but before the Special Criminal Court. But because the DPP saw this as a domestic incident, he's put before a trial and a jury.
Yeah. And I remember all this, guys in the Herald at the time, and I remember all of this was happening. There was loads of like incidents like firebomb attacks and just fear on the streets, and Ken Foy was writing about it a lot, and we couldn't name Robbie Lawlor because he was facing trial. It was attempted murder, I think, so it was a very serious charge, so we couldn't name him. He was in prison, and then there was some incident between him and Cornelius Price in prison, I think, and when he got out I think late into 2019 out of jail. Obviously that trial collapsed and
he was found not guilty.
He was found not guilty, yeah. And we, I still remember the story Ken did about how someone's going to be killed. This guy is so dangerous.
Yeah.
It was only a couple of months then when Keane Mulready-Woods was murdered. Like,
I mean, there was a red alert sent out to all the stations in County Louth because, of course, when he'd been in prison and there was an incident with Cornelius Price, they called the Judas handshake, that Cornelius Price sort of picked him out and he was slashed and got 24 stitches across the face or something like this. So he had beef with him. And then he's in prison and his brother-in-law, Richie Carberry, is shot dead as part of this feud. And Robbie Lawlor immediately blames Mr. Big, who's this other kind of shady character who comes in as well. Robbie Lawlor gets out of prison intent on taking vengeance for the murder of his brother-in-law, Richie Carberry. And he just is approached on the street by the young lads. And they take the gym bag, that famous scene again, which was posted on social media.
Yeah.
That seemed to have sent him completely over the edge.
Yeah.
And he identifies Keane Mulready-Woods. Now, we went into the absolute dynamics of how that happened.
Yeah.
Who was where, who was involved. There seems to be only one individual not identified in it.
Okay.
Who was involved in driving a car. But everybody else so far has been identified and brought before the courts in recent months even.
Yeah.
But Robbie Lawlor just identifies Keane Mulready-Woods, who's again an interesting sort of a character. He's only 17, but he's already doing the bidding for others.
Yeah.
So he is absolutely, he's involved in arson attacks on homes. He's trying to collect drug debts. He's been directed by older people. And he seems to be of the opinion that he's safe with Paul Crosby when he goes to meet him that night.
Yeah, exactly. Even though, as Eamon says, his dad was said in cab documents by the Criminal Assets Bureau to be working with the other faction, the Maguires. Yeah. But yeah, he obviously did feel safe enough. And he's seen talking outside the house. It's just kind of poignant, and then he's never seen again. And, the gear that he's wearing, the Canada Goose jacket and the cap and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, he obviously did. And I suppose this is the thing I was thinking about, because this is, as you say in the podcast, the most shocking gangland murder in Irish history. But, a lot of people talk about his age. I think there's also talk about, even though he was 17, he was, because he was groomed into this and because he had actually carried out some quite crimes, hard crimes himself. He terrified a mother when he was looking for a drug debt that her son owed. So there was a little bit of talk of he was involved in this, and this is what happens when you get involved, even though he was very young and he was groomed into it. But I think the element that no one can get past is just the gruesome nature of how his body was treated after he was murdered. That's the part of it that is just absolutely chaotic. And I don't think.
And how Robbie Lawlor took him into that home in Drogheda and did that.
Yeah.
And then left directions for what should happen, the body parts, which was just Mexican narco stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what created such a shock value.
Yeah.
And brought the politicians to Drogheda.
Yeah.
And brought the resources then to the policing and to clamp down and stop this feud. But still, Lawlor went on, and of course he was later murdered in Belfast, and the Boylans are still out there on the run. Paul Crosby, we were discussing, will be out as still a young man.
Yeah, did he get, was it 10 years or he didn't see, and he would have served a couple of years already when that was when that happened. So yeah, he will, because he's only, so that was 2020, so he'd be 30 now, and he's probably out in 5 years, maybe, I'd say. So yeah, so he will be a very young man, really, in the context of having served a serious sentence. And obviously,
and always be linked and known as being part of that.
Yeah, but if you just look at the main protagonist in that, it does kind of show the kind of what's that word? How fleeting gangland is in terms of it's just so fickle, because obviously, Robbie Lawlor, being the violent guy he was, took it upon himself to kind of mete out this punishment, and he thought it was a kind of I suppose he thought it was going to like terrify everybody. Yeah, but sure, then he was murdered 5 months later.
Yeah.
And then Cornelius Price, who celebrated Robbie Lawlor's murder, he died from natural causes. So a lot of these, and then the others are all in prison. So Maguire's obviously out.
Yeah, it is quite amazing. And I suppose when a community's in the middle of it and the Gardaí are trying to police it, because at one point the thing had got so out of control that the chief in the area was considering bringing in the army. The army. Because they actually felt that Drogheda was on the balance that it was law and order had broken down.
Yeah.
That these feral gangs were unpoliceable nearly. Now, it did all come back when obviously this happened and the resources were given, and, every resource of the state went after them then, the Criminal Assets Bureau, organised crime, and there was kind of a proper funding given to the actual policing in the area.
Yeah.
But it's a moment where when you're living in it, you just don't think it's ever going to end. And then it just all unfolds.
Yeah. And like the street, like those couple of streets in Drogheda, like where you were constantly seeing it in the news. And obviously, Keane Mulready's torso was eventually found around there and stuff. And you just think the people living there, like it must be terrifying for them, or must have had been terrifying for them, like every day, not knowing what's going to happen in relation to, is there going to be a firebomb attack, an arson attack? Because you're dealing with, I think that's the thing, and that's what happens when criminal gangs are allowed to groom these youngsters into crime from an early age, because they sort of are taught, they're growing up in the presence of this chaoticness. So then they just become, it's almost like they're, they don't have any fear of consequences. And I think when you have a lot of young volatile guys who just don't care what happens to them, this is what the result of it. And this is kind of what happened with the Drogheda feud. You just had these really, really like violent guys who come from tough backgrounds and didn't care, and like it was just lawlessness. So it's good now that it's under control, but a lot of people had to die, and Keane Mulready-Woods' murder was absolutely pointless. The kind of, if you think of not any murder is pointless, but in terms of the reasons that Robbie Lawlor seemed to have and all that kind of thing, he was murdered, Cornelius Price is dead, the feud is imploded, and you just think of how this 17-year-old was treated. It's just the epitome of how gangland just is gonna end bad.
So Killing Keane, and we're going to play, stay tuned because we're going to play the first episode of this. It's a 5-part podcast, subscriber only special, and it's on crimeworld.com. Along with a nice little collection we're building here. We have The Regency, we have The Science of Fear, The Bloody Reign of Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, Christy Kinahan, The Dapper Dawn, and obviously all our other Crime World Presents podcasts are there. Groomed, Double Cross, Evil Eye, Caught in the Crossfire.
Yeah, no gangsters safe. We'll get to them all eventually.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm just looking at it and it's very gangland heavy, all right.
It is, yeah.
Tack.
Yeah.
We have some stuff coming up actually we're working on at the moment, which will be a slight change into another sort of a cold case, a unsolved murder, which will be fascinating as well. And all the time, obviously, there's more stuff that I'm going, we better do something.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just constantly busy.
So have a listen. And if you want to listen to the full series, go on to crimeworld.com and hit subscribe.
I want to assure the public and the people of Drogheda that Gardaí will have all the resources they need. They need to find the people who carried out this crime and make sure that they are brought to justice. I want to reassure the people of Drogheda, in particular, that we stand right behind them, and I plan to get there in the next couple of days because the whole country is really shocked by this. In the longer term, we need to really act seriously to tackle the underlying causes that give rise to violent crime in the first place. It is probably the most gruesome, grotesque murder that I can think of. To have it perpetrated against a 17-year-old is just particularly shocking to me. We're going to make sure that Gardaí and Coolock and Drogheda are given resources to find out who did this and bring the perpetrators to justice.
You're listening to Killing Keane, a 5-part podcast series which tells the story of the grotesque murder of teenager Keane Mulready-Woods at the height of a violent gang feud that engulfed Drogheda. This is a Crime World subscriber exclusive series. Episode 1, Gruesome and Grotesque. Eamon, we were just listening to you quote the then Taoiseach Leo Varadkar speaking on the 16th of January 2020. And of course, he's talking about this shocking development in the Drogheda feud, which had been going on for some time, a tit-for-tat feud between two rival factions of a drug mob that had split. But what had culminated was this horrific kidnap, murder and dismemberment of a teenager, a 17-year-old boy called Keane Mulready-Woods.
Yeah, so the Taoiseach was talking, I suppose, like a couple of days after this sort of drip revelation, this grotesque, absolutely disgusting story of the 17-year-old who'd gone missing on a Sunday in Drogheda. And the following day, his limbs being found in a sports bag, dumped in a housing estate in Coolock. And the day after, his head and feet are found in the boot of a burning car in North Inner City, Dublin. And it's something we hadn't really seen before in this country. And, it is something that you'd associate with some of the most violent scenes that we've seen in Central America and Mexico, where, some of the cartels have made a point of publicly beheading and hanging and burning, multiple people as a way of sending a message to their gangland rivals. And in this case, there was no mistaking from day one that this is what it was. It was a message of the most grotesque kind. And I mean, if anything, the Taoiseach at the time, Leo Varadkar, he wasn't understating it. In fact, he was quite restrained in his remarks compared to, as we'll hear, that people were absolutely repulsed by what went on, and people were in fear as well, because there was this sense of, I suppose, impunity that was being projected by the gangsters involved in the Drogheda feud. And it had been going on for maybe 6 or 7 years before that. There was this build-up to it. And then it had broken out into open warfare in the previous year and a half before this moment in time on the January the 12th. It was at this point then that I suppose it was like the lid was ripped off this can of worms, and it came pouring out, and people were genuinely shocked. They were looking for answers and looking for, in a pleading kind of way, saying, please tell us what's going on. Is this normal now?
A line in the sand had been crossed, and you see that when the government essentially steps in and starts to promise to crack down and to give the resources to the Gardaí. It's usually one of these shocking moments where the country has almost stood still because something has happened that would have been inconceivable beforehand. There's a few key characters that are going to take leading roles in the story that we're going to tell. And we will go into detail with them as we go along over the episodes. But I suppose it's worth mentioning a few of those people that we are going to be talking about. And one of them, of course, is Owen Maguire. And he is a mob boss of a gang that had existed in the Drogheda area for a long time. And they had a hold over the drug scene. They were the big gang. They had young people working for them. Along with his brother Brendan Maguire, the two of them pretty much ran Drogheda, which was a growing commuter town. A lot of people, working people, had been priced out of Dublin and had gone to Drogheda because of the transport system, the road network, and they were living and working there, and they had purchased houses. And they were exactly the kind of people, unfortunately, who fuel this, because they were working during the week, they had money in their pockets at the weekend, and they were buying cocaine. And really, this is a cocaine war within a small commuter town outside Dublin. So Owen Maguire and his brother Brendan are two of the names that we're going to hear a lot about. They had run this gang. A younger mob had decided they were sick of taking orders from them and decided that there was enough business there for them to take them on and take them out, the Maguires. This was sort of, the younger crew rising. And we have an individual comes along at exactly the right time for himself, a guy called Richie Carberry. He's from the Coolock area. He's a drug dealer. He moves up nearer the town of Drogheda, and he buys a house, and he sort of purports to be a regular businessman. He's a number of businesses in the area, but ultimately he is mentoring these younger gangsters that are taking on their bosses. He's supplying them with weapons, he's supplying them with drugs, and he's encouraging them, because for him ultimately to take over the lucrative turf of the Drogheda and wider area is something that's very attractive. So you'll have names like that. And ultimately what we will end up having is two groupings. The Price-Maguire group, we'll call them, which is Owen Maguire, his brother Brendan, and the late Cornelius Price, who takes a key role in this story. And then we have the Boylan organised crime group. Now, we're going to go back and look at some of the violent incidents that have occurred in the run-up to the kidnap and murder of Keane Mulready-Woods, because they're very significant. And we're going to read actually from an affidavit that you have got over your coverage of one of the Criminal Assets Bureau cases. This was a High Court proceeds of crime case that you attended against Owen Maguire and Brendan Maguire. This would obviously come later, but in it are some really good details about the significant incidents that happened in the run-up to Keane Mulready-Woods' death.
And part of it is actually, it gives a little bit of, I suppose, the violent history of the Price-Maguire gang before the split happened, when I guess the Boylan faction wanted to run kind of their own operation. But where the split really became obvious was in July 2018. Owen Maguire was shot at his house at Bay 4 Mel Halting site at Cement Road in Drogheda. And the person who shot him said the words, "These are from Keith." And Robbie Lawlor is the man believed to have pulled the trigger and the person who shot Owen Maguire and said those words. Lawlor was an associate of the Boylans, and again, these were now the rival gang, and this was very much the beginning of the open warfare between the two sides. And this affidavit,
Lawlor, of course, is a brother-in-law of Richie Carberry, so he's skin in the game here too, along with blood ties with Carberry. A very significant criminal already, a hitman for hire. He will also take a really key role in this story going forward.
And I suppose a lot of people are aware of some of the kind of, I suppose, the headline incidents that happened in Drogheda, but there was just so many, because this is something we'll talk about later, about the trauma and even the post-traumatic stress suffered by children and people living in places like Moneymore and Rathmullen Park, where some of these acts were carried out. People were witnessing armed guards on the street. They were witnessing houses being set alight. They were hearing gunshots. So, while they mightn't have made the headlines, they were having an effect on people in the area. So even let's say the following October in 2018, there was a gunman fired 12 rounds at the house of an associate of Owen Maguire, and that was in Moneymore. So, and then on the following Tuesday night, petrol bombs were thrown at the same person's house. You had then on Monday, the 5th of November in 2018, there was a petrol bomb attack on another associate on his home, and his car was damaged in the attack, and he was an associate of Keith Boylan, and of course the Price-Maguire organised crime gang were blamed for that.
And of course it was Keith Boylan that it said that Robbie Lawlor was referring to when he shot Owen Maguire and said to him, "These are from Keith." Now, Maguire survived that attack, but he was in hospital. You can see how quickly things escalate really after the shooting in July 5th of Maguire. Those incidents you've mentioned. There was raids as well a month later. Maguire's in hospital. He's recovering from this attack, but he will never walk again. He is going to be left in a wheelchair and with lifelong injuries. But literally a month after he is shot and survives, Gardaí search a house within that same halting site and they recover €270,000 in cash, which were concealed under the roof tiles. So there's bullets coming, but there's also money being taken because of the concentrated efforts by the Gardaí at this point. 270,000 for some of the stories we talk about might be nothing. That was a lot of money.
It was, and he had 97,000 taken just before he was shot as well. So, I mean, the guards were at this stage on top of them because they had been involved in this other violent feud with members of the Whitehouse family in Balbriggan, in which Benny Whitehouse was killed a couple of years previously. And there'd been a whole series of this sort of tit-for-tat violence going on there, albeit at a lower level, but there was significant violence being used. People being shot, people being badly injured with slash hooks. And you find, like, as kind of 2018 continues on, like, there's more attempts to bomb each other. Like, for instance, there's a Volkswagen Golf that was found had 2 flow gas cylinders and various petrol bomb components in it, and they thought that was going to be used as an attempt to blow up someone's house. The 7th of November, you had a premises that was rented by Keith Boylan, and the security gates were rammed. A vehicle was driven through the shutters of the garage. Again, this contained gas cylinders. So there's an attempt to get at each other's assets or get at each other's properties.
And it's almost immediately a case of kill or be killed on the 8th of November in 2019. Again, back at that halting site where Owen Maguire has been shot, there is a mobile home previously occupied by a former partner of his and their children, and it's been completely destroyed by fire. Maguire is still in hospital recovering from his injuries, and the mobile home, while it was vacant at the time, it's another message to him, isn't it? And that is in this affidavit delivered to the High Court by the Criminal Assets Bureau. It states that I believe the Boylan OCG were behind this attack.
And like we're talking about now the 7th and 8th of November.
Yeah. And
we've already 3 incidents. So there was another one as well where you had an innocent relative of one of the Boylans. Their house was attacked as well. There was a petrol bomb thrown at it. The same evening then, there was another... a person turned up and pointed a firearm at the home of Brendan Maguire, and there wasn't any shots fired. So there was these immediate tit-for-tat attacks are happening within minutes or hours of each other. So you can imagine kind of what people are feeling living in this area. The next day, they were called again to St. Anthony's Park, which is the home of Brendan Maguire, and they found damage there where there was a pipe bomb had gone off and damage was caused. So, and then again, the same day, there was reports as well of another car being set alight, which was registered to an associate of the Boylans as well. So it's continuing at a kind of an intense level.
And on war footing there, you can see that the Boylan OCG, they have the main man, Owen Maguire, injured and incapacitated in hospital. So they're going again and again for Brendan, who's seen as his number 2 and who's the next kind of in the next pivotal role within that gang. They're very organised in one way.
Yeah, and look, and there's an element to use, I suppose, serious weaponry. Again, there was, like, I think this is again just a couple of days later, in the middle of the afternoon on the 11th of November 2018, there was basically a viable pipe bomb was found in the exhaust of a car being driven by a girlfriend of one of the Boylans. And that only for the fact that it was in the exhaust pipe and there wasn't enough oxygen, it didn't go off. And then later that day, there's a car with gas cylinders driven to a house in Moneymore. Again, it was they believe it was they were targeting the Boylans again. And what happened in this case, we'll come back to it in more detail. But there was the car was later found burning. The gas cylinders didn't ignite or anything like that. But the person who had been driving the car was basically grabbed and taken to a house and had to be rescued by the Gardaí. But we'll probably come back to that at a later point to kind of give an idea of the sense of the violence that was going on in the town. And I mean, like, that was a serious enough occasion, and the armed guards were on the scene within minutes. So later in the month, we're back to the 28th, there was more kind of these petrol bomb attacks. A rock was thrown at... this is supposedly, again carried out by the Price Maguire. A rock was thrown out a window to break it, and then a bottle of petrol that was unignited was found near the house. So obviously the idea was that this would have followed in with a match to burn the house out. So it's getting repetitive, and we haven't got past 2018. And there's so many more of these targeting of houses, and often some of these people are simply innocent family members who are related to some of the protagonists on either side.
And there's a lot of detail here in this affidavit. Some of it we won't read out, but for example, on one date in November, and this is getting close to how those younger crews, those younger boys largely, who are sometimes teenagers, sometimes juveniles, have been used by both gangs to deliver these pipe bombs, to intimidate. Feuding and war costs money. So what you always have in tandem is a harder push for the gangs to be paid what they're owed by anybody, even small debts they will forcibly try to collect. And you see towards in November that the home of a lady whose name was damaged with a petrol bomb. She's the mother of a juvenile who's an associate of the Price Maguire gang and who's believed to have been trying to collect those debts and intimidate families who are being left with them. If a young person owed a debt, they'd often go to their parents looking for them. So his own mother is being targeted because he is targeting, other people's mothers to try and collect the drug debt. And you see that home targeted another occasion in the December. And that's where, I suppose, we have Keane Mulready-Woods at the heart of this story. He is also a teenager who has been caught up in this terror himself.
You actually see there was two incidents in December, on the 6th and the 10th of December in 2018 in Marley's Lane, and that's where Keane Mulready-Woods actually lives. So in one case, it was a car was set on fire, and again that was belonging to a man whose son was believed to have been involved in the criminality, as opposed to the owner of the car. Then there was a search carried out on the 10th in the area, and drugs were seized. A pipe bomb was discovered as well, and of course you had to bring the explosive ordnance disposal. The army bomb squad basically had to come out. So you're kind of seeing, for lack of a better word, but you're seeing all this criminal action going on in a small space, which isn't lost on teenagers or school kids or people who should be in school at the time. And it sets a pattern of this kind of high intensity, this level of you've got to pick a side, you've got to be on a team.
All the way up to the 19th of December, just days before Christmas, there's incidents that the Gardaí are discovering 2 pipe bombs and over 400 rounds of ammunition. And that discovery is made on Mary Street in Drogheda. The area was made safe, according to this affidavit, and the pipe bombs removed by the army for testing. And it's believed the pipe bombs and ammunition belonged to the Boylan OCG, and these items would be used against the Price Maguire OCG. Interesting where this is all coming from. Where is this? You're in an area, I suppose, that has previously, both these gangs have links to criminals both north and south of the border. There's an expertise in making these pipe bombs and an expertise in facilitating this weaponry. But it's there from the very beginning, isn't it? Those connections they have to get their hands on this kind of stuff.
There seems to be no shortage of pipe bombs in this, in this short space of time. I mean, you're talking, a 5.5 month period. And we've kind of glossed over some of the details. And I'm sure there was unreported and undetected incidents happening alongside, not to mention, as we know now, that there was an awful amount of messaging going on social media.
Yeah.
Which was obviously heightening tensions.
And all this while, Eamon, Owen Maguire is in hospital.
Yeah, and he's we don't know where he is. We presume like he was going through rehab, or he's in hospital. Like he was seriously injured. He was left paralyzed. He's still unable to walk. So all of this is in the background. So you can imagine.
From the policing point of view, the Gardaí and I do recall hearing that he at one point was pretty much, they had done as much as they could for him in the hospital and got him as much back on track as he could. But he was refusing to leave because he was as safe there, because the Gardaí also, the resources had to be placed on the hospital because clearly they hadn't killed him, so he remained a target. And the Gardaí, in their job, which is to protect the public and the community, had to protect the staff and the people in and out of the hospital. It made the nightmare even worse.
And I suppose this is kind of the ripple effects of these things. Like when you have violent crime going on in a community, people hold back, say, going to the boxing club or bringing the kids to a soccer game, or not going to at a certain time to schools, knowing that they might run into people who could be targets. And even people saying, if you're delivering food or delivering services to certain areas, you're only going to go at certain hours, or you might want to say, we can't do that. I'd say a lot of people were avoiding going in and delivering services, or in Rathmullen Park and Moneymore. And you can't blame, I suppose, tradespeople going in not knowing what they're going to meet if there's so much of this going on. And again, it feeds back into this whole kind of image of these gangs acting with recklessness and impunity, like the idea of delivering body parts around the place. I mean, they're putting pipe bombs in people's car at 3:00 in the afternoon. Like there is there's no fear of being caught. I mean, the idea of grabbing somebody and, off the street and bustling them into a house and taking out your revenge on them. All of this is, this huge sense of we can do whatever the hell we like. And then to have this kind of grotesque murder happen was why I think people were feeling so bewildered, like fearful and bewildered, I think is a good way to describe it.
And I mean, the resources of the Gardaí locally were stretched to the absolute limits. I mean, we have gone through some of the criminal activity that happened there. Each one of those crimes would have required a senior investigating officer and a team of people to gather CCTV, any witness statements that were available. There was seizures being made constantly, and all of that had to be processed through the system. I mean, for example, even on the 19th of December there in Moneymore, there was a large amount of cocaine seized with the value of about 130,000. But there was also €7,000 in cash seized. Now, that all has to go through the system and has to be signed off and, from point of view of resources, I suppose. The biggest next incident that happens comes on the 26th of February in 2019 when Brendan Maguire leaves the Gym Plus in the M1 retail park in Drogheda.
And he was with two other men. They got into the car and a gunman approached the vehicle and he fired directly at Brendan Maguire. He struck him in the upper body and arms. He was driven at speed straight to Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital where he got emergency treatment. And of course, this was believed to have been carried out by the Boylan organised crime gang as well.
Yeah.
Again, that was quite significant. He was left. He obviously he did survive. And we do know since that he has been left with lifelong injuries. He's difficulty using his arm. And again, like he pretty much got out of Dodge then not too long after that, and has been living in Rochdale near Manchester pretty much since then. But we're kind of into early 2019, so we're still tipping along, so to speak. So you've had these kind of open murder attempts on the two Maguires, and people left badly injured, and you still have pipe bomb attacks going on. And it's both sides carrying these out.
And what's clear from it is that anybody's fair target, the girlfriends, that has kind of seeped into this feud. While also, I think what's interesting from this affidavit is that the likes of Keith Boylan, who's one of the heads of the OCG on one side, he's actively involved, as well as having underlings and young teenagers carrying out his bidding, and the same way as Maguire, who's frustrated, no doubt, in hospital, not being able to be totally actively involved. But you have Keith Boylan actually pulling up outside people's homes and threatening to pipe bomb them, while you also have these young kids, teenagers on both sides being used in the efforts. Now, Brendan Maguire survived that attack, and I think significantly on the 8th of March 2019, is that even a month later? It's a month and a little bit later. It's about 5 weeks later or thereabouts. There is a serious attempt on the life of Richie Carberry, who is designated by the Price Maguire faction to be. They realise that Carberry is backing the young mob against them, and that Carberry is such a significant figure.
Yeah, and funnily enough, this is an incident where Richie Carberry was lucky to escape with his life, but refused to say a word to the guards who were tasked to investigate this. What they found, though, on the CCTV was the car pulling up. He opened the door to somebody who rang the doorbell or knocked on the door, and then immediately closed the door, who fired 3 shots into the front of the house, damaging the front door before fleeing the scene. Now, he wasn't injured, and he didn't report it to the guards. Wouldn't cooperate with them either. And again, this was this was more than likely, they believed, linked to the Maguire Price gang, that they had carried this out. Now, we do know later on, we'll hear more about Richie Carberry, and he was involved in more than just the Drogheda feud. And of course, he paid with his life for that. And that would be in November 2019, he'd actually get shot dead. But it may not have been directly linked to the I suppose, the internecine war between the Boylans and the Price Maguire, but to do with, I suppose, the higher layer, which is something that's going to run through this.
Yeah. Is
that Keane Mulready-Woods was a 17-year-old kid on the street, but it was actually he was at the bottom level of what was actually a very complex and layered underworld that was, who even the top guys mightn't be sure who to trust. And you had a lot of, very dangerous people and a lot of money involved. And it's this kind of murky life that this child had got himself into. And we can see then, again, like kind of the innocent people, like a local football club was searched because ammunition and cocaine had been hidden there. So you can imagine the effect that has on people, who are kind of using the sports facilities in the area. And again, there's other attacks and people aren't reporting it to the Gardaí. Like kids, like for instance, there were children were out playing on the 22nd of April in the Moneymore estate. This is 2019, and they found a gun-shaped item wrapped in plastic masking tape. So the guards went and found a gun. They found a backpack, and it also contained several pipe bombs. The gun was well maintained, contained no ammunition, luckily enough for the kids, if they had gone anywhere close to it. And this was found close to the home of the Boylans, and it's believed that it was going to be used against the Price Maguires.
Because, of course, that is a tactic for the Gardaí to try and, they're going to target the heads of the gang. They're trying to police what's happening in the ground, but ultimately they really, really have to actively try and remove the firearms and those dangerous pipe bombs from the system. And if they can locate them and take them off the streets, they're literally saving lives, in that one swoop. So that is very much part and parcel of their policing of this feud. I think in, a day after they discovered that, or the kids discovered the gun, which is the scenario of what could have played out there, is another frightening reality of drug crime. But a day later, a petrol bomb is thrown through the window of a home in which, again, another mother is targeted, a mother whose child is a close associate of the Boylan organised crime group, and it's believed the Price Maguires are responsible for the attack. Women are being targeted, mothers are being targeted, girlfriends are being targeted. Anybody is fair game, and this is a sort of a tic-tac war that each grouping is trying to build up as many, frightening attacks against the rivals as they can. And
2 days later, there's another daylight shooting. This isn't at Hardman's Garden in Drogheda. And this is the home of Derek Kavanagh. It's a man who is, suspected of involvement in criminality and close associate of the Price Maguire gang. This is all like in the belief evidence. This is all, high court evidence that was given by the guards. And 5 shots were fired towards a group of men who were standing outside his home. There was one man there. He was shot twice. He was hit a bullet in the left shoulder. A second one struck him in the leg, causing the bone to break. He was brought to the Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital, which isn't that far away, and did need surgery. We had to go to Beaumont for that eventually. It wasn't life-threatening. But again, this was a daylight attack. I remember that there was some of the video that went about online at the time, and it really gives, again, feeding into this sense of impunity and that the gangs can do anything they want, that they are the people controlling the streets. And of course, this was believed to have been carried out again by the Boylan gang. And literally 2 days later, they were informed of a petrol bomb attack on a house that was belonging to another member of the Boylan house. Now, this person wouldn't cooperate with the guards. They found a champagne bottle filled with petrol and stuffed with a cloth beside the house. But the resident there wouldn't actually talk to the guards about what had happened. And again, this man, he has no involvement in crime, but his son was again heavily associated with them. And of course, this would have been an attack by the Price Maguire gang literally days after the attack carried out by the Boylans at Hardman Gardens.
We should say at this point, and we'll come back to it later, but 2 of the very important figures in all of this don't feature in a lot of these incidents at this point because, of course, they're in prison. Cornelius Price is serving a term in prison, as is Robbie Lawlor. Lawlor is in jail. He is facing a trial where he's been accused of threatening to kill the mother of his former girlfriend's new partner. It had been alleged that he arrived at her house one evening and shot through the back door and into the house, that she escaped with her life. While the Special Criminal Court is operating pretty much on full tilt at this point, as the cases to do with the Kinahan Hutch feud are kind of coming up before the courts, a lot of gangland activity is handled before the Special Criminal Court, but in this case, the Robbie Lawlor allegations were dealt with as domestic crime, and therefore Lawlor was going before a jury. The trial was coming up at the end of this year in 2019. He had had an incident with the Cornelius Price when he was in prison awaiting the trial, where Cornelius Price had offered a hand of friendship, as they call it, the Judas handshake. And as Lawlor reached out his hand, two associates of Price had attacked Lawlor. So those two are still in prison at this point. Now, the Gardaí are aware, I think hopeful probably, that the case that Lawlor is facing, that he will be found guilty and maybe he will be locked up for the foreseeable future. But Cornelius Price is on his way out of jail, and his release is going to give the Maguire faction, the Price-Maguire faction, I suppose that little bit of strength they need, given that Owen Maguire is still laid up in hospital and weakened.
Yeah, and yet you say that they need of strength, but there's still this tit for tat going on. And I mean, like over the space of 3 days in April, this is after the shooting in Petrobras we spoke about, there was another 3 separate attacks. Different people. Again, these are often people who are simply known as being friends of some of the protagonists. They're not necessarily involved in crime at all themselves. You know, I mean, even say Keith Boylan on the 20th of June 2019, he's driving towards his sister's house, and a number of shots were fired from another car. He was struck on the chin and shoulder, and he was able to drive away. And again, back to Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital, where he was treated for his minor injuries. So, you know, even though I suppose the Price-Maguire may be kind of stripped of their leadership, or it seems they might be, they're still able to mount these serious attacks on leading members of their opposition.
On June 23rd, 2019, this affidavit lists a incident where a Barry Woods, who's a member, they say, of the Price-Maguire organised crime gang, reports that his vehicle has been petrol bombed. That may seem like a small incident, but Barry Woods is the father of Keane Mulready-Woods.
Again, I suppose this just shows you how enmeshed, even if he was, you know, a kid who wasn't necessarily involved in any criminal activity, he couldn't not notice what's going on around him. And that would have been for so many other young teenagers in the area who were kind of, I suppose, alternating between fear and excitement, and the idea of possibly making a few quid themselves, you know, and trying to make a name for themselves.
And that detail, I suppose, by linking Barry Woods to it details he is a member, it states, of the Price-Maguire organised crime gang, will become important later when, you know, the guards start to investigate Keane Mulready-Woods, the run-up to his murder, and who he was feeling he could trust. But we will come back to that. Now, on the 30th of July 2019, there's a report received from Fire Brigade Control of a fire at the Mel halting site in Cement Road, back again to where Owen Maguire had been originally shot by Robbie Lawlor. The site, it says in this affidavit, is council-owned. Subcontractors, namely New Line Utilities based in Northern Ireland, had been working there on behalf of Airgrid and the ESB network, and they had vehicles parked on site as they were working in the area. And of course, the fire has caused extensive damage to 3 lorries and 1 JCB teleporter parked at the location. And it's believed the Price-Maguire organised crime gang were responsible for this attack on their own halting site. So they had a problem, obviously, with some of the works that were being carried out.
Yeah, and I mean, this just adds into the whole idea of anarchy, that, you know, despite what we know, that there was a huge Garda investigation going on at this time. I mean, Operation Stratus, I think, was the code name given to it, and they were targeting a lot of the kind of the main people involved, like Cab are already getting into the Maguires. But you have this constant level of violence going on, whether it's criminal damage like this attack on this, you know, company machinery, whatever reason that the Maguires had for that, possibly too close to something they might have buried themselves, or they were possibly trying to extort money from contractors, which wouldn't be unheard of in that kind of work, in that line. But I mean, if you go on a week later, like there's a man who was, I suppose, linked or seen as being linked to the Boylans, and he's attacked by 3 men and badly cut up. He'd again presented himself to the local hospital with injuries to his head, hands and knees. Later in the same month, then you have the shooting of Keith Brannigan.
Which is the first murder.
It is. And when you consider what we've actually just talked about, it's amazing that nobody up to this point has been killed. I mean, there's been so many. I mean, there's been 3 attempted murders that we know of against, Carberry and the Maguires. And all of these arson attacks, any one of them, as we saw in Edenderry recently, that these kind of supposedly low-level attacks could end up in fatalities. And in this case, it hasn't. So when Keith Brannigan is killed on the 27th of August, 2019, it's seen as shocking.
And who is Brannigan?
This is somebody who's, he's known as a friend of Keith Boylan. Like there was no suggestion that he was involved in criminal activity himself, that it was possibly seen as a soft target and it was a way of getting at the Boylans. And if you remember at the time, there was photographs of, people's vehicles that were parked in the area with bullet holes in them. Mm. So again, it's feeding into this the crazy kind of wild abandon that these gangsters are getting involved in, shooting in public areas.
It was the Ashling Caravan Park in Clogherhead where many people spend the summer with their children. The 27th of August, families are locking up their caravans for the winter. They're returning back to their homes and ready for the new school year to start. That was so significant because that's why there were so many people around.
The list will continue on with it in a way. Like there was another young woman on the 6th of September, her car was rammed twice from a car behind her simply because she was a partner of a junior enough member of the Boylan gang. And again, one of these members of the Price Maguire gang had seen her and had just taken the opportunity to try and ram her off the road. She was, luckily enough, she was able to get away. She wasn't injured. But
that has echoes of what would have happened in Limerick because of the proximity of everybody to one another. And the same can be said of Drogheda. It's a big commuter town, but when it comes to this kind of warfare, it's a small enough town because people are going around doing their business. You could be going to the supermarket and somebody will, on the rival side will see these guys are feeling lawless enough to take an opportunity anywhere at any time of the day and no matter who else is around.
And once upon a time, they were all part of the same network, part of the same gang. So it's hard to get away from.
That's why they know one another's girlfriends. That's why they know where one another's mothers live and all this. And it makes it easier for them to target one another.
So as we are closing out November 2019, you have another incident where 80 rounds of ammunition were seized from a house. Again, this was a person who was an associate of Keith Boylan. He was arrested in connection with that. And again, they believe that, this was where it was because at some point they were going to try and use it against the Price Maguire gang. So we were in then, as you say.
Firearms and 80 rounds of ammunition.
Yeah, and so 3 firearms and 80 rounds of ammunition. Yeah, so I mean, it's not insignificant when you think about it. It's you don't have a gun because you want to frighten someone at this stage. When you consider the litany of violent incidents that have happened.
Now things have really heated up by January 2020, and the first major news story I think that came out from Drogheda was this incident where a taxi driver named John Miles came to collect a passenger called Paul Crosby, another individual we're going to hear a lot about, and a senior member of the Boylan OCG. Now, John Miles would speak later in relation to what happened, but Crosby got into the front passenger seat of the car and a woman sat in behind him, and they asked to be driven to a house in Moneymore, Drogheda. So John Miles took off in his taxi. He was driving across the town. He stopped in traffic on the Bridge of Peace, and a dark-coloured car with the registration still unknown pulled up beside the taxi. And it looked to him as if somebody was trying to get into the front of the taxi, but a man got out of the car and started firing into the front passenger side window of the taxi, injuring John Miles. So it was obviously all rather chaotic for this man who's going about his work. This is on a main bridge, a street into the town. The gunman got back into the dark-coloured car and sped off in the direction of Drogheda, and leaving the taxi driver injured and his passengers fleeing for their lives. We're going to come back to John Miles later and how he would later describe that ordeal that he underwent, because we're on to the 13th of January 2020 here, and we're not very far away. In actual fact, it's the next day that the worst of the worst occurs.
And of course, don't forget, Robbie Lawlor is now out of prison. So he was released in the middle of December, I think it was. He's been acquitted of an attempted murder, and he's back on the streets. There's an incident with some kids. He's taunted about flip-flops. And he is angry over his brother-in-law, Richie Carberry, being killed, and he's looking for vengeance. And unfortunately, there was fear about him getting out of prison, and he did actually live up to everybody's worst expectations. We've now reached the 12th of January 2020, and Keane Mulready-Woods, who is caught up in this internecine gang warfare, is I suppose, lured in by Robbie Lawlor. And Robbie Lawlor, who is looking for revenge over the murder of his brother-in-law, over being taunted by other young kids on social media. And it's Keane Mulready who pays the ultimate price.
Now, the immediate response to this, because what has happened as regards to how Keane Mulready-Woods has been lured, how he has been murdered, how he's been dismembered, how his remains are deposited in different locations, will all emerge. But in the immediacy of this event, it's up to the Gardaí in Drogheda, at the time headed up by the Detective Chief Superintendent Christy Mangan. And he is overseeing this point really when have the Gardaí lost control? Have gangland taken control? This is a shocking incident, and he needs to address the public. He needs to assure them that the Gardaí are there, that they're going to secure the community, that they have the backing of government. But he also needs to appeal to the public to help with this. And in doing so, and he spoke to us about this on our Double Cross series, and he spoke to me from my book, Web of Betrayal. He describes how it's almost nearly a marketing technique to use the word child. He really needs to emphasise that Keane Mulready-Woods is not a young thug caught up in this gangland. He needs to touch into the empathy of the community and people at large in order to help solve this and really help clamp down on these people who are literally out of control. So we'll hear what Christy has to say about that.
We really, really emphasised that Keane was a child. And he was a child. He had become caught up between the warring factions, an impressionable young person. He was a boy trying to make his way in life. And he wasn't unlike a lot of other young people all over Dublin, all over every major town in Ireland, where people do become involved at an early stage in criminal activity and then grow out of it. And thankfully they do. The majority do, actually. It's only a small minority will continue right into their 20s and 30s and maybe serve long prison sentences. So there was every possibility that Keane could have got through this. But I suppose an indication of the level of his involvement, he actually had a ballistic vest. At 17 years of age, 18 years of age, to believe that you need to wear a bulletproof vest says a lot. And, he obviously felt under a certain level of threat himself. But in any of the major investigations, I would use the media, in a way to get your message out there. And, the media will always seek out information as best they can as regards to crimes that are taking place or whatever atrocities that are taking place. But we wanted to get the message out there, that Keane was a child and that we weren't going to let this simply sit, and that the investigation would bring the people involved to justice.
One of the things noting about that is that Keane Mulready-Woods He wasn't old enough even to buy cigarettes. He wasn't old enough to go into a bar and have a pint. You know, it kind of brings it home. And I know he was close to his 18th birthday. He was just a couple of weeks short of it. But like, he was already, had been groomed, had been caught up, and had been dragged into this world. Even the kind of the description of his clothes he was wearing when he was reported missing by his mother on the 13th of January, kind of give an indication of what had happened in one sense. Like, he was wearing a red Canada Goose jacket, and they cost at least €400 at the time. He was wearing a Gucci baseball cap with a serpent wrapped around its peak that sold at the time new for $250. He was wearing a Hugo Boss tracksuit, expensive runners. It was probably about €1,200 worth of designer gear that this kid had on him.
It's almost a uniform when you look at the picture, isn't it? That it's the uniform of that teenage drug dealer.
Yeah, and this was his giving him his kudos. This was, you know, marking him out as, you know, a player. That he was in terms of his peers, he was head and shoulders above them. Now, he was so far out of his depth.
Was he a player? Because, I mean, we've heard before, like, that his father was a member of the Maguire OCG, but who exactly was he?
Look, he was a 17-year-old kid who had not been in school, had dropped out. People had tried to keep him involved with sports clubs, and at one point he worked in, I think, the kitchen in the school in a kind of, I suppose, a vain attempt to keep him connected to the educational system. I suppose when we're saying, like, you know, he wasn't a player, but like, he was marking himself out as if he was one. But he had been involved in this kind of criminality where the older guys were using these kids to carry out this drug enforcement, you know, the debt enforcement. They were going to people's houses, you know, demanding money. This is the usual thing. If you have to come back for it, you pay double. And sometimes this is over small amounts, like €100, €200. Like, for instance, in when he was just 15 in 2017, there was a complaint that he had allegedly pointed a gun at a manager of a shop in Drogheda, and this was captured on CCTV. And then more seriously, in 2018, he was accused of criminal damage, threatened to cause serious harm to a local family, and the victim was a mother who told Gardaí that Keane had threatened and terrorised her into paying her child's drug debt. Now, he was convicted on December 17th. Days before that court hearing, Gardaí also suspected him of being involved in a petrol bomb attack on a car in a local housing estate. That's one of these many instances that we're kind of hopefully not bored the listeners with, but that we were trying to give an idea of how, you know, intense this was. And he was living in the middle of it. And as we know, like, was sometimes taking part in it. Now, his sentence had been deferred over threatening the woman and her child. And that was deferred until a later date because they wanted to see if he released on bail, if he'd live up to his bail conditions. And at this point he had been. And it's one of the reasons why his mother was able to report him missing so quickly, because he hadn't come home on the night of the 12th, and he had been living up to it. Even on the 5th of January, Keane was given a Garda information message that his life was in danger, and there was suspicions that he had actually acted as a spotter during the murder of Richard Carberry, which may be something, whether it's true or not, that idea probably sealed his fate when it came to, I suppose, Robbie Lawlor's animus towards him and why he wanted to get rid of him. So,
and of course, these pieces of intelligence, who's who on a murder, they actually filter into the underworld quicker than they reach the kind of the official Garda intelligence or reach us. That's the first place that news will have travelled, or that rumour will have travelled, that Keane was suspected of being a spotter on that murder. He is operating, we know, collecting debts and working for the Maguire faction, to which his father is detailed in this CAB document as being a member of. The father had reported, as we mentioned, his car being petrol bombed in the June of 2019. But Keane, as we will see as we move forward with this story and over the next few episodes, had some sort of a naivety to him, because he believed he was friends with both sides, even though these were deadly lines drawn between what was one gang and which was now two different sides. He had no fear about who he was going to meet the night he was murdered. It seemed he believed that he had an impunity himself.
Yeah, I mean, he got a call from a leading member of the Boylan gang, and he dropped everything, got into a taxi and went to meet this person. And he didn't know it, but he was walking into a trap. He was walking to his death.
You've been listening to Killing Keane, a Crime World subscriber exclusive podcast series hosted by me, Nicola Tallant. Producer, Ian Malini. Writer, Eamon Dillon. Graphics, Enda Bulger. And assistant producers, Nasa Kumisky and Chloe McPolan.